Claire's voice was steady, almost rehearsed, as she sat across from me, a faint smile playing on her lips. I had expected anger, regret, maybe even tears, but what she gave me instead was cold indifference. She didn't even flinch when she said it, "I've been seeing someone else. I've been with him for months now. I'm not happy with you anymore, Adam. It's over." She leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning me with an air of finality, as though waiting for me to crumble. I could almost hear the unspoken words hanging in the air, "Now beg me to stay. Tell me you'll change, fight for me." But I didn't. I didn't say a word. I just stared at her, processing the weight of her words, my mind oddly clear. This wasn't a moment to beg. This wasn't a moment for weakness. It was a moment for control, for strength, the strength I had never needed to show before, but now I was called to do so. She had expected me to fall apart, to beg her to reconsider, to fight for the marriage we had built. Instead, I did nothing. No tears, no anger. No pleading. Nothing. I stood up from my chair, not even bothering to look at her as I turned to leave the room. Her voice called out behind me, her tone laced with disbelief, "You're just going to leave like that?" I didn't answer. What was there to say? What was the point in trying to convince someone who had already made up her mind? Claire had already decided that our marriage was a casualty, a story she was done with, and I was just supposed to be a footnote in her life. But I wasn't going to play that part. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me beg. The silence that followed my exit was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. She probably expected me to come back, to apologize for some mistake I hadn't even made, to tell her how much I loved her, how much I needed her. But there was nothing left for me in this relationship. Nothing left but a shadow of the man I had been, shackled to someone who had already moved on in her heart and mind. The next morning, I woke up early, my mind already set on what I needed to do. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the quiet of the house seemed almost unnatural, as though the walls themselves were waiting for the storm to break. Claire was still asleep, her back turned to me as I lay next to her, but I couldn't find comfort in the familiar warmth of her presence anymore. Everything about her, everything about us, felt like a lie. As I quietly slipped out of bed, I noticed her breathing, soft and steady, the way it used to be before everything had changed. I didn't hate her, not really. But I couldn't stand the thought of continuing to live a life where I was nothing but a man left to clean up the pieces of a broken marriage while she went on her way, carefree. No, I wasn't going to be that man anymore. I wasn't going to beg, wasn't going to fight for something that was already over in her heart. She had already made her choice. I moved through the house with practiced precision, gathering my things. There were no dramatic actions, no emotional outbursts, just a quiet, deliberate preparation. I started with the clothes in my closet, choosing only what I truly needed. I packed everything I'd require to start fresh somewhere else, carefully folding each piece and slipping it into my suitcase, but never with any urgency, only calm purpose. I didn't need to rush. I'd thought about this moment for hours now, and I knew exactly what I had to do. The kitchen, usually the place where we'd make breakfast together, felt like a foreign space. I couldn't bear the thought of sitting there and pretending everything was fine. I could almost hear Claire's voice in my head, asking where I was going or what I was doing. I didn't owe her an explanation. She had already taken her own steps, betrayed the trust we built over the years, and now I was doing the same, walking away. As I packed, my mind wandered to the night before, the way Claire had looked at me with such disbelief. It was as if she couldn't fathom my lack of reaction. She had expected tears, regret, desperation. She had expected me to beg. But what did she want? A show of emotion, a hollow display of attachment. Something to validate the lies she had told herself about our marriage. I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. No, I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Not anymore. I wasn't going to be that man who lived in the shadows of someone else's expectations. I moved to the bathroom, where I packed up my toiletries with the same quiet efficiency. I couldn't help but notice how everything around me felt increasingly alien. The toothbrush I had used for years now seemed like a stranger's. The comb that had been on the counter for as long as I could remember felt out of place. Every object in this house now felt like a symbol of a life that wasn't mine anymore, a life that Claire had erased without a second thought. When I finished packing, I stood for a moment, staring at the empty space where my things had been. The house that had once been our home, where we had built a life together, was now just a shell. A quiet, empty shell. I had nothing left here. I left the bedroom and walked to the front door, pausing for just a second. It would be too easy to leave a note, to give her an explanation, but I knew that would only complicate things. She wouldn't need closure, and I certainly didn't owe her any. Instead, I simply opened the door and stepped out into the cool morning air, the door clicking shut behind me with a finality that echoed through the empty house. Claire didn't wake up until hours later. By then, I was already gone, my presence erased without a trace, as if I had never been there in the first place. No note. No explanation. No goodbye. Just the silence of a life I had walked away from, leaving nothing behind but the lingering sense of a betrayal she had yet to truly grasp. She called me, of course. She texted. I ignored it all. Every call, every message, every attempt she made to reach out. I didn't need to listen to her pleading or her excuses. I didn't need to hear the same words that had been said 1,000 times before, the ones that always ended with promises to change, to fix things that had already been broken beyond repair. Days passed, and Claire's attempts grew more frantic. I could see the desperation in her messages, the pleading to talk, to understand, to fix things. But I had nothing to say to her. There was nothing left to say. She had shown me exactly who she was, and I had no place in her life anymore. My life was mine again, and I wasn't going to let her take that from me. Not anymore. In the end, she would have to face the consequences of her actions. She would have to understand that her betrayal had cost her not just my love, but my presence. I wasn't going to be her emotional crutch, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me into staying in a marriage that was already over. I had made my choice. I had chosen myself. And that, more than anything, would be the thing she could never take away. When Claire woke up that morning, she felt an unfamiliar emptiness in the house. The soft hum of the coffee maker, the familiar smell of Adam's cologne lingering in the air, and even the slight creak of the floorboards, everything seemed wrong. She stretched her arms out, reaching for him instinctively, but her hand met nothing but cool sheets. At first, she assumed he had gotten up early for work, though the thought felt strange. Adam had always been the kind of man who lingered in bed just a little longer, savoring the quiet mornings. But when she checked the clock, she saw it was already well past 9. Still, she pushed aside her nagging discomfort and climbed out of bed, deciding she'd just give him a call or text. Maybe he had gone out to grab breakfast, or perhaps he'd been caught up with something unexpected. When she reached for her phone, she noticed something strange: his side of the closet was empty. All the shirts, the suits, the shoes, they were gone. Her heart skipped a beat, and a wave of panic washed over her. Claire quickly scrolled through her messages, searching for anything from him that might explain this sudden absence. There was nothing. No goodbye. No message. No explanation. She checked the bathroom. Empty. The desk in the study, where Adam kept his work materials, was the same. His laptop was gone. His notebooks were nowhere to be found. It was as though he had simply vanished from their lives in the blink of an eye. The weight of the situation began to settle in, and Claire felt the air around her grow thick with disbelief. She stood frozen in place, the silence pressing down on her chest as if the entire world had suddenly gone mute. It took a long moment for her to gather her thoughts and move towards the kitchen. She grabbed her phone, dialing his number without hesitation. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then went to voicemail. "Hey, Adam. It's me. Where are you?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but failing. She hung up and immediately texted him, "Where did you go? Can we talk about this?" There was no response. At this point, Claire was truly beginning to panic. Her mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios. Was he angry with her? Had something happened to him? The more she thought about it, the more she convinced herself that it was something to do with what had happened the night before. The revelation of her affair, the way she had thrown his love back in his face, the way she had expected him to beg, had he been so hurt that he had decided to leave? But why wouldn't he tell her? Why wouldn't he at least confront her or say something? The thought of him leaving without a word felt unbearable, and she couldn't bring herself to face the reality of it. She thought about calling his best friend, Mark, or even Adam's sister, Emily, but deep down, she knew they wouldn't have any answers. She had already made her choices, and now it seemed Adam had made his as well. Hours passed, and the unease in the pit of her stomach deepened. Claire wasn't used to feeling powerless, yet that's exactly what she felt in this moment. She had always prided herself on being in control of every situation, every relationship, every aspect of her life. But now, Adam had turned the tables in the most devastating way imaginable. He had taken the one thing she had relied on for so long, his presence, and walked away from her, leaving her with nothing but the hollow weight of her own actions. She spent the rest of the day trying to reach him in every way possible. Calls. Texts. Emails. She even left a voicemail begging him to come home, to talk to her. "Adam, please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I just need you to come back. We can fix this." Her voice wavered, and she hated the way it sounded, desperate, pleading. But nothing changed. There was no reply, no sign of him. By evening, Claire was exhausted, emotionally drained. She couldn't stop thinking about Adam, about the way he had simply vanished without a trace. She didn't understand how this had happened. One minute, they were having an argument, and the next, he was gone. It didn't make sense. How could he just walk away like that? Was it a final blow from a man who had finally had enough of her manipulations? Or was he hurt, confused, and retreating into some silent form of vengeance she couldn't quite grasp? The worst part, the part that kept her awake that night, was the emptiness. There was no comfort, no closure. Adam's absence hung over her like a thick fog. No matter how many times she checked her phone, no matter how many calls or texts she sent, it didn't change anything. He was gone. And in his absence, Claire was forced to face the consequences of her actions in a way she had never imagined. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay in their bed, the same bed they had shared for so many years, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her own breath, and reflecting on everything she had done to bring her marriage to this point. She had convinced herself for so long that she could have it all, that she could have the excitement of an affair without consequences, that Adam would always be there to forgive her, to understand her. But now, she was left with nothing but the painful reality that her choices had cost her the one person who had always been there for her. As the days passed, Claire's disbelief began to give way to frustration, then to anger. She wasn't used to feeling like this, helpless, abandoned. She had always been the one to hold power, to dictate the terms of every relationship. But now she was the one left to pick up the pieces of a broken marriage, and there was no one to blame but herself. Everywhere she went, there were reminders of Adam. The coffee cup he used every morning. The old jacket he had thrown over the back of the chair last night. The toothbrush in the holder. It was all so painfully real, and the longer she avoided confronting it, the more impossible it felt to move forward. Her world had shifted overnight from one of certainty to one of deep, aching uncertainty. And in the quiet of the house, she realized that she had no idea how to fix it. Adam was gone, and the silence he left behind was deafening. The days blurred together in a haze of frustration, confusion, and anger. Claire had always considered herself a woman of control, of influence, someone who could shape situations to her will. But now, nothing seemed in her grasp. Adam's absence was like a weight that hung over her every thought. He hadn't left a trace, not a clue, nothing that could point to where he had gone or why. His disappearance felt surreal, as if he had slipped into the ether, vanishing without a single word. She had expected him to beg. That much was clear. When she had told him about the affair, when she had so coldly declared that she was done with their marriage, she had been certain he would react the way all the men before him had. She imagined him crumbling, pleading for forgiveness, desperate to salvage what they had. It was the pattern. She knew it. And yet, Adam hadn't followed it. Instead, he had surprised her by doing something she couldn't have foreseen. He had walked away without a word, without a fight. As the days passed, Claire's initial disbelief slowly turned into something else, something far more unsettling. It was the realization that Adam had made a conscious decision to disappear. He wasn't just avoiding her calls or taking some space to cool off. He had vanished, fully and completely. No note. No goodbye. No promises to return. Nothing. And that was what stung the most, the silence, the absolute void left in his wake. She spent hours pacing around their house, a place that used to feel like home but now felt like a prison. She tried to go through the motions, pretending like she had everything under control, but every corner of the house whispered reminders of what she had lost. The photographs on the walls, the books they had shared, the little things that once symbolized the life they had built together, each one seemed to mock her now. She called friends. She called family. She even called the neighbors, hoping for some sign, some clue, something that could tell her where Adam had gone. But everyone was as confused as she was. No one had seen him, no one had heard from him. He had simply vanished. It was as if he had evaporated into thin air, leaving her in a state of helplessness she hadn't experienced before. At night, the silence in their home grew unbearable. Claire lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the emptiness pressing in on her from all sides. The bed they once shared was now just a cold, lonely space. She had expected Adam to beg for her forgiveness, to fight for their marriage. She thought he would be the one to fall apart, but it had been her who was left scrambling to understand what had happened. Each passing day, her anger began to shift. It started as frustration, a sense of disbelief that Adam could simply walk away from everything they had, and then it turned into something darker. She felt betrayed, but not by Adam, by herself. She had been so sure that everything would stay the same, that their marriage would endure despite her actions. But now, as the silence stretched on, Claire realized something she had refused to face before: Adam had finally reached his limit. It was a bitter pill to swallow. For years, Claire had manipulated situations, had convinced herself that no matter what she did, Adam would always be there. He had always forgiven her. He had always been the steady, silent force in their relationship, the one who kept everything together. But now she understood that even the strongest man could break, even the most patient partner could finally walk away when pushed too far. The shock of it hit her hardest in the small, quiet moments. She found herself looking at her phone, waiting for a message, a sign, anything that would indicate that Adam was still out there and still cared. But nothing came. The messages she had sent, begging, pleading, apologizing, remained unanswered. The voicemail she had left, the texts asking him to come home, all fell into a void. And it was then, in those moments of silent waiting, that the full extent of her actions began to dawn on her. She had thought she could handle this, that she could make her choices without consequences. She had convinced herself that she was justified, that the affair, the lies, the manipulation, all of it could be swept away with enough time and sweet words. But now, Claire saw the truth: she had destroyed the very thing she had taken for granted. Her own selfishness had cost her the one person who had truly loved her, who had been there for her through everything. The realization was crushing, and Claire's frustration turned to desperation. She couldn't understand why Adam had done this to her, why he had left her like this, with nothing but the echoes of their broken marriage to haunt her. She called him again, and again, and again, until her fingers grew numb from the constant dialing. She texted him every word of remorse she could think of. She apologized for everything, for the affair, for the lies, for taking him for granted. But there was still nothing. No response. No sign of life. It was as though he had closed a door and left her on the other side, locked out of a life she no longer knew how to reach. Days stretched into a week, then two. Claire tried to return to work, to go out with friends, to keep up appearances. But it was all a lie. The emptiness followed her everywhere. She couldn't escape the truth. She had driven Adam away. And now she had to live with the consequences. In the end, the power she had once wielded so effortlessly over him had slipped through her fingers. And now, as she sat alone in their home, surrounded by the remnants of their life together, Claire realized that it wasn't just Adam who had left her, it was herself, too. She had abandoned the person she had once been, the person who had loved him, the person who could have fought for their marriage. And now, there was no way back. The days that followed Adam's disappearance felt like a slow-motion collapse. Claire moved through her life like a woman in a fog, her every action mechanical, her mind constantly circling back to the same questions: where was he? Why hadn't he come back? Had he really meant it when he left, or was he simply punishing her? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she would never know the answers, and that uncertainty gnawed at her from the inside out. The house, once filled with the rhythms of shared life, small conversations, laughter over meals, the quiet comfort of a partner who had been there through everything, was now empty. Even the space seemed quieter, as though Adam's absence had sucked all the life from the rooms. Claire avoided the places they had once enjoyed together, the spots where memories lingered like ghosts. She couldn't sit at the kitchen table without remembering how they had spent hours there, discussing everything from the trivial to the profound. Now, the table felt like a cold, foreign object. She had tried to reach out to friends, to fill the silence with their company, but it never worked. The reality of her situation was too overwhelming to escape, and deep down, she knew that her friends could never understand the depth of what she was going through. None of them had ever been in a relationship like hers, where trust had been betrayed so deeply, where one moment of selfishness had shattered everything she had taken for granted. Claire could feel her heart growing heavier each day, the weight of what she had lost pressing down on her chest. And still, Adam did not return. The phone calls and texts went unanswered. She had been sure he would come back, that he would reach out when the shock of his departure wore off. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched on, Claire began to realize that Adam wasn't coming back. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back from that. It wasn't just his absence that hurt, though. It was the knowledge that she had pushed him to this point. She had assumed, for so long, that he would always forgive her, that his patience was infinite. She had convinced herself that his love for her was unconditional, that no matter what mistakes she made, no matter how many times she hurt him, he would always be there to pick up the pieces. But Adam's departure had shown her how wrong she had been. He had finally reached his limit, and that realization was like a cold slap to her face. The first time she allowed herself to really feel the loss of Adam, it came in the form of a memory. It was a small moment, one that she hadn't thought about in years. She had been sitting on the porch, drinking coffee, watching the sunrise. Adam had come out to join her, and they had talked about nothing, about the weather, about plans for the day, about the small, everyday things that had always meant so much to them. The memory hit Claire like a wave, overwhelming her with a sense of loss she couldn't describe. She had taken all those moments for granted, assuming they would always be there. But now, they were gone, and so was Adam. It wasn't until the third week of his disappearance that Claire fully acknowledged the depth of what she had done. She had spent the previous days cycling through emotions, anger, frustration, regret, but now, there was only a hollow acceptance. Adam was gone, and the marriage they had once shared was over. There was no going back, no fixing things. She had hurt him too much, and in the end, he had chosen to walk away rather than stay trapped in a cycle of pain. She sat down one night in the quiet of the living room, the house still and cold around her. The silence felt suffocating, but in that moment, it also gave her clarity. She realized that she had spent so much of her life trying to control things, trying to bend people to her will, trying to make them fit into the box she had created for them. She had done that with Adam, assuming that he would always stay, always forgive. But now she understood that love couldn't be controlled, and trust couldn't be taken for granted. Adam's departure was the consequence of her choices, and she could no longer escape it. It wasn't easy. There were days when the guilt and sadness felt like they might swallow her whole. She wanted to scream, to shake Adam awake, to make him understand that she was sorry, that she hadn't meant for things to go this far. But deep down, Claire knew that none of that mattered anymore. Adam had made his choice, and he had done what she had never expected him to do, he had walked away. And she had to accept that. Slowly, Claire began to rebuild her life. It wasn't about moving on, not yet, it was about finding herself again, discovering who she was without Adam, without the marriage that had defined so much of her life. She started taking long walks in the park, reconnecting with herself in the quiet moments. She spent time with friends, rediscovering parts of herself that she had neglected. It was hard, and it didn't happen overnight, but bit by bit, she began to understand that her identity wasn't tied to Adam, to their marriage, to the life they had built. She was more than her mistakes. She was more than the woman who had pushed her husband away. One evening, as she sat on the porch again, the same spot where she had once shared a quiet morning with Adam, Claire realized that she had stopped waiting for him to return. She had stopped clinging to the hope that somehow, he would come back and fix everything. The silence that had once felt suffocating now felt peaceful. It was as if she had finally given herself permission to breathe. Claire had lost something precious, but in doing so, she had found something even more valuable, herself. The journey ahead would still be difficult, but she was no longer the same woman who had let her insecurities and selfishness control her. She was someone who had learned the hard way that love, once broken, couldn't always be repaired. And she had learned, perhaps too late, that some things, once lost, were lost forever.